There is a story many years ago of a primary school teacher. Her name was Mrs. Edwards. As she stood in front of her fifth grade on the very first day of the school,
Good morning, children.
she shared with her class something that wasn't completely true. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and said that she loved all of them equally, with no difference whatsoever.
You know, you all are very special to me.
But that was impossible, because there, in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy called Chris Jones. Mrs. Edwards had watched Chris the year before and noticed that he didn't play well with other children, that his clothes were messy, and he didn't take interest in studies. His lack of interest in his surroundings was rather disturbing for Mrs. Edwards.
Chris, you're looking untidy today. Got into a fight with someone? As usual?
And Chris could be unpleasant at times. It got to the point where Mrs. Edwards would actually take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen, making several bold cross marks, as if to prove the point that Chris had done rather badly.
Alice, would you like to join us for coffee after the school gets over?
I wish I could, but you have to excuse me today, as my students' review study is still pending for some time now. You enjoy yourself? I will catch up with you later.
Bye.
Bye.
At the school where Mrs. Edwards taught, she was required to review each child's report card of the previous years. Mrs. Edwards had put on hold Chris's file till the very last. However, when she reviewed his file, she was in for a big surprise. His first grade teacher wrote, "Chris is a bright child with an excellent sense of humor. He does his work neatly and has very good manners. It is a sheer delight to have him in the class." His second grade teacher wrote, "Chris is an excellent student, loved by his classmates, but he is in some distress because his mother has a terminal illness and life at home must be a struggle." His third grade teacher wrote, "His mother's death has been rather hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father doesn't show much interest in him. His home life will soon affect him if some concrete steps are not taken immediately." Chris's fourth grade teacher wrote, "Chris is completely withdrawn and doesn't show interest in the school or in studies. He doesn't have friends and he sometimes even sleeps in the class." By now, Mrs. Edwards realized the root cause of the problem and she was rather ashamed of herself. One day, as she walked into the class, she was in for a pleasant surprise when children greeted her on her birthday.
Happy birthday, ma'am. Thank you. That's a lovely one.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear ma'am. Happy birthday.
Thank you. I'm so happy. Thank you so much, my dear children. Wonderful. Lovely color.
She was happy, at the same time felt even worse when her students brought her presents wrapped in beautiful ribbons and bright paper, except that of Chris. His present looked very clumsy, wrapped in the heavy brown paper that he got from a torn grocery bag.
So thoughtful of you.
Mrs. Edwards took pains to open the present in the middle of the other presents. Some of the children started to laugh when she found a rhinestone bracelet that was broken with few of the stones missing. She further took out the bottle that was only 1/4 full of perfume and the rest was empty.
Perfume! How about
She actually stopped the children from laughing while putting on the bracelet and exclaimed,
Oh, you've got a lovely piece of jewelry. So pretty.
Next, what she did? She dabbed some of the perfume on her wrist.
Mellowed fragrance. But it's lovely. It's a very nice fragrance. Thank you, Chris. Come here.
Chris stayed after school that day just long enough.
Mrs. Edwards? Today you smell just like my mom used to.
Mrs. Edwards cried for at least an hour. On that very day, she decided to quit teaching just how to read, write, or do some arithmetic. Instead, she began to actually teach the children. She stopped being just a teacher and decided to become an educator and a mentor instead. Mrs. Edwards paid special attention to Chris. As she worked with him, his mind seemed to come alive. The more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. The teacher-guardian relationship thrived, and the regular home visits followed.
Steps. Yes. Put a border to that. Put a border. Yes. And then it has to be dark.
By the end of the year, Chris had become one of the brightest children in the class. And despite her lie that she would love all the children the same, Chris became the teacher's pet and the most favorite student. An year later, she found a note under her door. It was from Chris, telling her that even though Mrs. Edwards did not teach him that year, since he was in a new class, she was still the best teacher he ever had in his entire life. Six long years went by before Mrs. Edwards got another note from Chris. He wrote that he had finished his high school, stood third in his class, and she was still the best teacher he ever had in his entire life. Four years after that, she got yet another letter saying that while things had been rather tough at times, he had stayed in the school, had stuck with it, and would soon graduate from the college with the highest of honors. He assured Mrs. Edwards that she was still the best and the most favorite teacher he ever had in his entire life. Then, another 4 years passed, and a new letter came. This time, he exclaimed that after he got his bachelor's degree, he decided to go a little further. The letter further explained that she is still the best and the most favorite teacher he ever had. By now, his name was a little longer. The letter was signed Dr. Chris Jones, MD. Well, the story doesn't end here. You see, there was yet another letter that spring. Chris said he had met this girl, fell in love, saw rainbows day after day, and they were going to get married. He explained that his father had died a couple of years ago, and he was wondering if Mrs. Edwards would agree to sit in the place at the wedding that was usually reserved for the mother of the groom. Of course, Mrs. Edwards did accept that invite. And guess what? She wore the same bracelet, the one with several rhinestones missing. And she made sure that she was wearing the same perfume that Chris remembered his mother wearing on her last birthday together. An excited Dr. Jones held Mrs. Edwards' hand and escorted her up the stairs.
Thank you, Mrs. Edwards, for believing in me. Thank you so much for making me feel important and showing me that I could make a difference.
Chris, you have it all wrong. You were the one who taught me that I could make a difference. I didn't know how to teach until I met you.
And dear friends, that was a teacher's lesson.